Many of Nintendo's recent games have been sequels to some of its earlier franchises, and many of those games have in turn been racing games, and that's essentially the case with 1080 Avalanche, which is the sequel to good old 1080 Snowboarding, a 5-year-old game that made quite a splash back on the Nintendo 64. It was certainly among the best, if not the best, snowboarding games of its time. So some people, fans of that game, have been highly anticipating 1080 Avalanche, if only because it was one of the first games to be announced for the GameCube, so it's really been a long time coming. However, you really wouldn't know any of that just from playing 1080 Avalanche. It actually is a game that plays quite well, and it has a lot of neat touches in it that you can't find in other snowboarding games on the market. But on the other hand, it's really very simple. There really isn't much to it. You can see just about everything this game has to offer in just maybe 2 or 3 hours, and at that point you're stuck with kind of a rudimentary multiplayer mode. So 1080 Avalanche is really better served as a rental than as a long-term investment, but for what it is a pretty fun snowboarding experience that delivers a pretty thrilling sensation of speed. 1080 has a few different modes of play. They include the match races, the time trial mode, the gate challenge mode, and also a trick mode where you're trying to score high by combining a series of tricks together. The trick system in the game is really not that fleshed out. It's pretty simple. You just kind of plant yourself for a jump and then spin around and pull off various grab tricks while in the air. In all modes except the trick mode, doing this does nothing other than to power up a meter which, when full, allows you to either recover from a crash very quickly, or it allows you to knock your opponent down if you run into him or her. So you could gain a competitive edge that way. The powered up state doesn't run out unless one of these things happens. So basically what ends up happening in most of the races is that you'll pull off just enough tricks to get to this powered up state, and then you won't bother pulling off any more tricks because they might just slow you down. The goal of most of the modes is just to reach the finish line before any of your opponents as quickly as possible. The match races, the main mode of play, are actually quite simple. They consist of 3 progressively higher difficulty settings, and there's actually a 4th one that's unlocked after you finish those, and you need to compete in a series of these events against only one other racer at a time, and whoever reaches the finish line first wins. You only have a limited number of lives to make it through one of these heats, so unless you make it in 3 tries through like 4 or 5 or 6 different races, then you'll have to start that sequence of events over. There's some pretty blatant rubber band AI going on here, so that the races are always going to be pretty close no matter how well or how poorly you're doing, though it does keep things pretty interesting. There are some pretty frequent last-minute victories and defeats in this game. The core action out on the slopes is actually quite well done. There's a really good, well-done sensation of speed here, as mentioned. You get these speed lines rushing across the screen, the camera begins shuddering, and there's even like a fisheye effect on the camera. Everything will seem to bend as you're moving really fast. So at best, this game is really very fun to play. It controls responsively, and it has some cool little graphical touches like animals skittering around, and your rider will kind of flinch when you nearly miss an obstacle. Little things like that. He or she will even get caked in snow after you land in some. There's some cool environmental effects, especially these gigantic avalanches that'll be chasing behind you in a couple of the races. On the other hand, it's pretty easy just to master the racing in this game. It's really not very challenging, except for maybe the expert missions, which, again, you could still get through in a couple of hours. As for the time trial mode, it's sort of misnamed because all you're really trying to do is collect fractions of coins there so that you can unlock additional boards. The gate challenge mode, meanwhile, can be pretty fun. It teaches you to snowboard precisely through the various gates that are strewn about. And the trick mode, since the trick system in this game isn't all that deep, can be interesting, but not for particularly long. 1080 offers split-screen multiplayer as well as multiplayer over a local area network. The latter option just isn't viable, so unless you have a bunch of friends with copies of this game and GameCubes and a network hub and stuff like that, then it's sort of a throwaway feature, besides which you could still only play 4 players over the LAN. Actually, unfortunately, the split-screen multiplayer mode isn't that good either. The 4-player version of the multiplayer mode has some pretty bad frame rate problems. You just get some pretty ugly, choppy performance out of this game, making this mode not very enjoyable. It runs a lot better if it's just you against one other friend of yours. Still, you're limited to just 6 courses in the multiplayer version of the game. Overall, 1080 Avalanche really isn't a bad game at all. It's quite fun to play for as long as it lasts, but the main problem is it just doesn't last very long at all. There just isn't a whole lot to it. But if you're looking for a snowboarding game or just a fast, high-speed racing game for the GameCube, it does have something to offer you, and it's worth a look, maybe for a rental over a weekend.